you to resolve conflict among interests and principles of sovereign parties. In Moscow, septuagenarians struggled to position themselves in the succession to the ailing Brezhnev, with what consequences for the United States or Israel or the rest of the world, we don't yet know. In Israel, the major debate of the moment concerns whether, on the one hand, to create insurmountable obstacles as an excuse for abrogating the Camp David Agreement, or on the other, to return the Sinai to Egyptian control on April 26th. Such is the playing field of international politics on which our speaker tonight has been an exemplary force of reason. From his stunning speech before the UN General Assembly advocating Israeli statehood in 1948, to his skillful representation of Israeli interests in the Suez Crisis, the Six-Day War, and the Yom Kippur War, Abba Eban has been a diplomat among diplomats. As he's once said, and I quote, "Men can be influenced in two ways. One by force, two by expression in speech and writing." Mr. Eban's distinction as a master of the spoken and written word has earned him the title of the eloquent diplomat. This reputation, I think, has followed him around from his childhood in London to the top of positions in Israeli and international life. He learned Hebrew at his grandfather's knee and soon thereafter the command of several other languages. While at Cambridge University, he not only received first-class honors in Oriental Studies, but earned a celebrated reputation in the United Kingdom as one of their most outstanding debating chairmen. Mr. Eban carried this excellence from academic circles into the realms of Israeli politics. He was Israel's first representative to the United Nations, and his facility with languages kept his colleagues there always slightly off guard. The story is told in the General Assembly of Mr. Eban sitting between the delegates from Iraq and from Lebanon, as Israel was at that time ranked, who would often try to speak to each other behind him in Arabic on points of procedure. They could never quite figure out why Israel always seemed to be one step ahead in these discussions, until it was finally revealed that Mr. Eban spoke Arabic very well indeed. From 1963 to 66, Abba Eban served as Deputy Prime Minister of Israel, from 66 to 74 as Minister of Foreign Affairs, a job which he very nearly recovered in the recent elections of 1981. During the tumultuous years of his service to Israel, he has maintained a constant vision for peace in the Middle East. His innovations and approach to peace have often been stifled, not only in the struggle among Mideastern nations, but also in the shifts of domestic Israeli politics. But Mr. Eban is a statesman who has always dared to be different. He has consistently held that self-government for the Palestinians on the West Bank is the best solution for a lasting peace. In his autobiography, he wrote, and I quote, "The 20th century boundary does not have to be a barrier. It can also be a bridge," close quote. Mr. Eban's vision of Israel is one that extends beyond its geographical limits and into the enlarging dimensions of history and culture. Currently, he is developing this message as a message to the world as a narrator of WNET TV's extensive 10-part series, The Civilization of the Jews, which will be aired in 1983. In the meantime, we have the very great pleasure to welcome tonight to Harvard one of Israel and the world's great statesmen, Mr. Abba Eban.
I'm very grateful to you, Dean Allison, for the warmth and sincerity of your welcome. Let me assure you that it does me no harm at all to hear my qualities described with objective restraint. Perhaps in the ordinary course of events, I would have sat there blushingly dissociating myself from such generous praise, but as a working politician in an election year, I can't afford to admit that any praise of myself can be excessive. It might seem at first sight that no speaker is ever likely to suffer great harm at the hands of his chairman, but that is an illusion. There is sometimes grave cause for apprehension. I experienced this recently in one of the southern states of the United States when I was presented to an audience by the president of one of your southern universities. He was a man of few words, which were, however, more than adequate to cover the entire range of his thoughts. He presented me to the audience in the following terms. You are now going to hear Abba Eban. Some of you have heard him before, some of you have not. Those of you who have not heard him before are no doubt looking forward to it eagerly. You will understand why after that traumatic experience I listened to chairman's introductions with initial tension but with ultimate relief, and as today with very great appreciation and gratitude. My second tribute of thanks goes out to all of you for converging here in such large numbers tonight. By this you bear witness to the constructive disquiet with which the American people follows the fortunes of the Middle East in this turbulent and formative hour. I rejoice in the opportunity to expound this theme within the auspices of a house of learning. I assume that scholarship has something to offer in the development of international relations and the promotion of international harmony. The cooperation between governments and academic institutions in this field has become much more intense in recent decades. Most governments, no matter how secretly convinced of their own omniscience, have the habit of calling for academic analysis and advice. And many members of the academic profession, as you well know, move impressively between their chairs and the centers of power and authority. In all of our countries, the reputation of intellectual pursuits in government has risen. I can testify that even for a working politician, a discrete measure of literacy is no longer an insuperable handicap. It can, with time and patience, be lived down. Now, the idea that intellectuals are of any use whatever in politics and statecraft has a formidable adversary in the greatest of all Arab historians, Ibn Khaldun. Let me, for the sake of humility, remember what he says in chapter 6, section 41 of the great introduction to history, the Muqaddimah. Scholars of all people are those least familiar with the ways of politics. The reason is that scholars are used to mental speculation and to a searching study of ideas. They also tend to compare things with others that are similar to or like them, with the help of analogical reasoning, but conditions existing in civilization and society cannot be compared with each other. The intelligent and alert segment of civilized people falls into the same category as scholars. They seek ideas, analogies, and comparisons. Therefore, says Ibn Khaldun, they commit error. And he goes on and concludes, the average person of a healthy disposition and a mediocre intelligence judges every situation by its particular circumstance. His judgment, therefore, the judgment of a man of mediocre intelligence, is therefore not infected with analogy and generalization. Such a man has the right outlook for political activities. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if Ibn Khaldun considered mediocre intelligence to be the best qualification for statecraft, it is a pity that he's not alive today to draw consolation from the spectacle of the contemporary international scene. you will not expect me to endorse Ibn Khaldun's preference for amateur improvisation. After centuries of recorded experience in peace and in war, mankind has accumulated a valuable mass of empirical knowledge about how conflicts arise, how they are kept in control, and sometimes even resolved. And yet there are very few disciplines in which the tension between theory and practice is more acute. Governments have done much more than universities to keep the two perspectives in balance. Most governments and foreign ministries use the service of academic experts, but very few faculties of international relations understand the need to have working ambassadors in their midst. Ideal or fanciful notions about how the diplomatic process works re-echo across many campuses on the basis of theoretical models without ever being subjected to comparison with that which is illogical but real. I've never met a professor of surgery who has never performed a single operation, but I have met professors of international relations who have never negotiated an agreement or argued a case in an international forum. And thus, scholars and diplomats are in a constant polemic, and each of them has a case. Working diplomats tend to doubt whether fixed doctrines are applicable to specific cases. They embrace Paul Valéry's definition of history as the science of things that do not repeat themselves. They are convinced that doctrines have a lesser role in shaping policies than facts, and that those who come to diplomacy with fixed conceptual systems do not have the freedom of maneuver, essential to a changing world. The scholars vigorously respond that diplomats, by professional deformation, tend to sanctify situations to which they are accredited. They are reluctant to admit that ostensibly stable conditions of power are liable to swift and radical change. And since they are always accredited to existing regimes, revolutionary currents are outside their scope of duty and therefore create surprise when they come to a point of explosion. Scholars also deride the degree to which diplomacy is tied down by rigid formalities. They point out that the traditional procedures whereby diplomats celebrate the practice of earlier times take such a heavy toll of a diplomat's life that he becomes functionally incapable of innovation. The diplomat responds that if his thinking is inexact, that is not because of intellectual indolence, but because diplomacy really is an inexact science. In the words of one of them, men act in diplomacy because they must. Their alternatives are restricted, their choice is hedged about, and the ground on which they stand is not wholly of their own choosing. Decisions are made oftentimes not for want of other more desirable intentions, but because the range of practical choice excludes them. I cannot think that there is any area in which the gulf between theory and practice is as broad as in the Middle East, especially in relation to the pathos and tragedy of the conflict on which you've asked me to expound my views tonight. Coming from Jerusalem some 10 days ago, I bring you the message of an ambivalent mood. Ambivalence perhaps is written deep into the character of our own skeptical national frame of mind. Things are never totally black or totally white. There is the somewhat irreverent secular joke about Moses coming down from Mount Sinai with no less than 15 commandments, to which his turbulent consistency replied that this is really much too much for anybody to absorb, still less to observe, and he was implored to go back and try to get it abbreviated. Back he came with the message saying, I have good news and bad news. The good news is that we've cut it down to 10. The bad news is that the bit against adultery is still in. The feeling that there is both good news and bad news will run as a current, perhaps, through everything that I bring to you. On the one hand, the air of Israel is alive with a sense of innovation. Within less than 2 weeks, we shall reach a stage of fulfillment in the implementation of one of the most revolutionary events in the modern history of the Middle East, the Treaty of Peace concluded 3 years ago between Egypt and Israel. Nothing has changed my conviction that the voyage of Anwar Sadat to Jerusalem in November 1977 is a revolutionary turning point in the sense that it separates our past from our future. Let us be frank with each other. Underneath the outward surface of vitality and exuberance in Israeli life, there has always been something choked, something strangled, something cut off from expression, a terrible sense of insolubility, deadlock without end. The sense of being contemptuously excluded from any affirmative contact with the neighboring world has been much more deeply at work on the morale and the consciousness of the Israeli people than we have ever wanted to admit. What was the use of brooding on something for which there seemed to be no remedy? And now all of a sudden the windows are open and the air comes rushing in. Israelis no longer awaken every morning with the sentiment of being hermetically enclosed in an implacable ring of exclusion, hostility and contempt. This was the element of audacity and innovation in Anwar Sadat's initiative and in the response which it evoked in the Israeli people. We face today a new challenge of contact, diplomatic contact, economic contact, cultural contact, above all, human contact. The Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty is one of the greatest victories for international conciliation in our time. Similar victories of such scope and acuteness can only be counted on the fingers of one hand. The American opening to China, the establishment of the European community, bringing an end to traditional wars in a continent that had been the crucible of hostility, the Zimbabwe-Rhodesia settlement, not many transitions from explosive conflict to a formal peace which has every prospect of evolving into the emergence of a new life and a new hope. This is an astonishing achievement when we compare this relationship with the rancor, the antagonism, the hostility that existed for 30 years, bursting out every few years into the flames of active and frontal war. I therefore confess that I'm astonished by the skepticism with which the Egyptian-Israeli treaty is accompanied in much of world opinion in Europe, even partly in the United States. Some people can't take yes for an answer. For many decades, the prospect of peace between Israel and any Arab state seemed to be a utopian fantasy. Now that it has come to pass, the world is full of commentators and pundits and experts telling us all about its limitations. Well, the limitations are real enough, and the burden of them will soon be upon us. Peace with Egypt is not the totality of our ambition or of the region's need. And yet I advise you to avoid the rather parsimonious skepticism which tells you, yes, but it's not a comprehensive settlement. Yes, but it's only with Egypt. Yes, but it does not offer guidelines or direction for a solution of the residual problems and especially of the Palestine problem. None of these limiting criticisms is valid. First of all, don't say only with Egypt. Egypt is not only one of 22 Arab states. Its population is nearly as great as that of the other 21 Arab states put together. The only recognized center of Arab policy and culture. Above everything else, the repository for so many years of the military option. Subtract from the totality of Arab manpower and armament the armament and manpower of Egypt, and it is doubtful if the Arab world has a credible military option at all. To have neutralized the area from the constant probability of regional war is itself a massive achievement. And do not say it is not a comprehensive agreement. Where do you get comprehensive agreements? Do you have it in Southeast Asia? Did you get it in Korea? Was it possible to construct a comprehensive agreement for peace and security in Europe except by patient negotiation over 30 years with separate agreements with Germany, with Italy, with Japan, with Finland, with other countries of Eastern Europe, until these separate agreements coalesced into what is now a comprehensive settlement. If you say that we mustn't make peace with one Arab people until we make peace with all of them, do you not give a deadlock to the most obdurate issue and to the most intransigent party? If you say don't move until all the 22 states and the Palestinians are ready to move together and simultaneously, well, for how long shall we have to wait? Shall we have to wait until President Gaddafi of Libya experiences a unique spasm of lucidity? Shall we shall we have to wait for the Messianic age? But when the Messianic age comes, the very need for diplomats will be transcended by divine grace. No, it was right to begin somewhere before beginning somewhere else. And if you had to begin somewhere before somewhere else, where better to begin than at that great central crossroad where all the currents of Arab history and culture and policy converge. Do not say that it has nothing to offer for a solution of the Palestine problem. What it does offer is an exemplary hint about how solutions grow out of hostility. First of all, I am convinced that the agreement will be carried out. I'm certain that Israel's contractual integrity depends on the fulfillment by the 26th of April of everything that was concerted in Camp David. It might be useful for us to be reminded that the parties at issue had to make great sacrifice to reach that peace treaty. Egypt had to sacrifice the whole vocabulary and repertoire of ideas, of slogans, of emotions, of rancors, which have dominated Arab nationalism for more than 3 decades. It was a massive ideological renunciation. In a world which is ideologically conservative, I do not remember such abrupt abandonment of past slogans and past concepts. Egypt had to give up more than its past slogans. It also had to give up, probably temporarily, its central place at the head and center of the Arab family. And this was done with calculation and with the assurance of the sacrifice by the very strength of Egypt's demographic and geographic and cultural weight, would in the long run be able to reunite itself with a family of Arab nationhood and Islam. But Israel had to give things up as well, things much more concrete and tangible. We had to give up a naval base. We had to give up airfields. We had to give up access to a neighboring source of oil. We had to give up cities and villages in which thousands of our people had built their homes. We had to give up the sense of space and distance, whereby Sinai had reassured a vulnerable Israel about its strategic security for 13 years. Even those like myself who believed that Israel should make such sacrifices for peace have never been under any misapprehension concerning their painful and traumatic character. There were other difficulties which the negotiators had to overcome. In addition to the psychological difficulty for Egypt to separate itself from the legacy of past slogans, and for Israel to think of security in a much more compact, somewhat claustrophobic context, giving up the spaciousness with which it had been briefly familiar, the parties also had to overcome great difficulties inherent in the contemporary international system. Now, this is the first age in which diplomats have had to negotiate simultaneously with their adversary and with their domestic constituency. Traditionally, these two stages were separate. First, you negotiated agreements in reticence and discretion, far from the penetrating eyes of the public media. When the agreement was ripe for acceptance, it was presented for confirmation or repudiation to the constituencies concerned. But now the media are not satisfied with this. They insist in being present even at the primary and intermediate stages of negotiation. The penetrating eyes are everywhere. And this makes agreements very difficult to achieve. Agreement implies compromise. What do we mean by compromise? Compromise means that you accept today that which you swore last week that you would never accept. Well, it's a necessary and salutary exercise. It isn't something that politicians like to be photographed doing. Compromise implies concession. Your adversary, you say that the concession that you offer him is so painful as to be almost beyond endurance. In the meantime, you whisper to your anxious constituency that your concession is really quite trivial, and only your own brilliance and your adversary's gullibility have given it a certain weight. Well, the trouble is that the wind carries your words in both directions. Your constituency and your adversary each hears what you mean for the other. I doubt whether even the most successful summit meeting in history, that of our ancestor Moses on Mount Sinai, would have been successful if after every one of the 10 Commandments he had to be interviewed by Barbara Walters and Walter Cronkite and then had to bring the text to the anxious Israelis below for scrutiny by the Knesset Committee on Foreign Affairs. I hope that I do no injury to any of my colleagues on that committee if I express doubt whether all the 10 Commandments would have achieved a majority vote. An agreement that had to make its way through such obstacles deserves to be celebrated in the understanding of its limitations and also of its scope, and also a sense of the guidance that it offers in a solution of the other outstanding problems. What does it teach in relation to the Palestine problem? It teaches this. It teaches that once Israelis see peace not as a fantasy, but as a concrete prospect, all their previous ideas about territory and boundaries and the impossibility of living in a more compact framework are superseded in the revolutionary atmosphere created by the reality of peace. If anybody had asked Israelis in cold blood a few years before 1977, wouldn't it be a good idea to give up the whole of Sinai and Sharm el-Sheikh and the Rafiah salient and the bases and the aerodromes and the oil and the villages? Everybody would have said you must be crazy to suggest it. But once Anwar Sadat transformed the psychological atmosphere in which the question was asked by giving a concrete vision of a new harmony of peace, a new regional order, all of these things were eventually accepted. The question is, why do not our other neighbors understand this? That in a sense, they hold the key to the evolution of Israeli thought and of Israeli policy. This was the lesson that I often used to hear from Anwar Sadat and have also heard from Hosni Mubarak, that in grounds of sheer empirical experience, this method has proved effective. And Egypt is entitled to say to its colleagues in the Arab world, what have you gained by your method? By revolutionary violence, by the Palestine Covenant, by the philosophy of rejectionism, not a single grain of sand. Whereas by this method of peace and negotiation, there has been territorial restitution, there has been a vast uprooting of Israel from positions in which it seemed to be permanently embedded. This method has proved itself in the test of action. That is really what the Egyptian experience offers to the others. Why not try it? I confess that my own experience tells me that men and nations do behave wisely once they have exhausted all the other alternatives. It seems to me that the alternatives to a negotiated peace have been exhausted. And I'm convinced that if on the Syrian, Jordanian, Palestinian side there were to develop some dramatic ideological audacity, such as that of which Anwar Sadat proved capable, a similar psychological transformation would take place, perhaps not with totally similar results, because there are security and territorial sensitivities. But in general, I believe that the pattern would assert itself. And those in Israel who believe, as do I, that one cannot maintain a permanent jurisdiction over a foreign people would find that their doctrine would have a far greater support, and it has great support already, by reason of offering a concrete prospect. But if the rejectionists, Syria, the PLO, unfortunately Jordan as well, refuse not only the doctrine of a unitary Palestine projected by our government, but reject also the concept of a territorial compromise proposed by my party, what is the use of Israelis quarreling amongst themselves about alternatives which are rejected on the other side? In other words, this debate in Israel, which is searching and far-reaching in its effects, reaches to the depths of our respective visions of what Israel and Zionism are. This debate would have operative reality if, on the Syrian, Jordanian, Palestinian side, the concept of peace with Israel were to celebrate a victory which it celebrated in Cairo and Jerusalem in 1977. Let me be quite specific. If they say Palestine instead of Israel, all of us say no, thank you very much, nothing instead of Israel. For Israel's independence and identity are the central moral imperatives here. With all respect, whether the Arab world has 23, or God forbid only 22 Arab states, is not morally comparable with whether the Jewish people enjoys the possession of its tiny but cherished home. I do not agree with the slogan of Israel needing recognition of its right to exist. I do not ask anybody to recognize Israel's right to exist, because Israel's right to exist is independent of anybody's recognition of it. There must be something which is there must be something in the international system which is axiomatic, and the recognition of identity is not the destination of a negotiation, it is the starting point of a negotiation. What we need is the recognition of our right to exist, but concrete, pragmatic work in constructing a security system which would be a viable alternative to the maintenance of jurisdiction over territory inhabited by a foreign people. In other words, the counterpart to withdrawal is not recognition, but it is security. Security implies a careful delineation of boundaries, which would be different from the 1967 boundaries. Security means the whole system of demilitarization that proved so decisive in Sinai. And security means Israel's assurance about the approach and the mind and the heart of those on the other side. We have a right to know to whom we make renunciation. Do we make it to those who would use the territory as a bridge to peace, or to those who would make it a springboard for hostility? It's a legitimate question, and it is legitimate to condition this in our approach to all aspects of a peace settlement. So Palestine instead of Israel, no. If the world can get used to the existence of 22 Arab states, it had better get used to the existence of one Jewish state as well. But if they would say Palestine as well as Israel, in other words, a method of solving the problem on the basis of Israel's undeniable existence, then a whole variety of options open out, including one to which at least half of the elected Israeli establishment is pledged. In my party, there was unanimous support in our conference for the following principle. We opposed the idea of permanent Israeli rule over the 1.3 million Arabs of the West Bank and Gaza. We must seek such a delineation of boundaries and of security arrangements as would exclude them from our permanent jurisdiction under a peace settlement. This is not a statement about Israel's international relations. It is a particular image of a society which, in the view of some of us, would see its central vision disrupted if it were not able one day to see these people not as subjects but as neighbors. There does not exist on the face of the globe a single free democratic society composed of two such disparate elements as the democratic parliamentary state of Israel and 1.3 million people who are held coercively in our jurisdiction by the necessities of security, who do not share with us a single memory or a single dream, a single form of speech, a single concept of identity, whose flag isn't our flag, whose tongue isn't our tongue, whose faith isn't our tongue, is not ours. Some element of separation must be envisaged. And here the Camp David Agreement deserves a much closer scrutiny by the Arab world, and especially by the Palestinians, than it has received. It is not in any sense an anti-Arab or an anti-Palestinian document. I regret to tell you that the diplomatic history of the Palestine Arabs is full of occasions on which they have rejected proposals conceived largely in their interest, only to hark back to them nostalgically once they have receded from view. Thus they emerge from every crisis with a new nostalgia, but not necessarily with a new wisdom. And it's not difficult to trace the proposals which they rejected in the past, to any one of which they would give their fidelity if it were available today. Some people never lose a chance of missing an opportunity. It seems to me this is correct about the rejectionist reaction to the Camp David Agreement. Why should they reject it? It offers full autonomy in a transition period, not as a permanent solution, but as an interim arrangement. It calls, and I quote, for the withdrawal of the Israeli military administration and its replacement by an Arab self-governing authority. It calls for the development of these autonomous institutions for 3 to 5 years, after which the final status of the West Bank and Gaza shall be determined by whom? Not by Israel unilaterally. President Sadat secured from Mr. Begin an Israeli signature renouncing a unilateral Israeli right to determine the status of the West Bank and Gaza. The West Bank and Gaza status must be determined, and I quote, by negotiation and agreement between Egypt, Israel, Jordan, and the elected representatives of the Palestinians themselves, by a forum in which there are 3 Arab participants and Israel. Not likely, in my opinion, to be a forum which will vote for annexation to Israel. Egypt, Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinians. That isn't the kind of quartet that's likely to play Hatikva at the end of 3 or 5 years. It is true that the prospect of life within some Arab framework arises only after 3 to 5 years, but you cannot deny the evolutionary principle in peacemaking. We would not have achieved peace with Egypt in a formal treaty, but for the intermediate stages: ceasefire, 1973, disengagement, 1974, interim agreement, 1975, Jerusalem voyage, 1977. These were the stepping stones across which we were able to traverse the Gulf. The Camp David Agreement offers stepping stones similar to the disengagement and interim agreements with Egypt, which eventually led to a treaty of peace. If you say that you must jump the river at one leap, you're likely to end up with a very loud splash, but with no effective landing on the other side. It seems to me, therefore, that disinterested opinion ought to cleave with great fidelity to the Camp David agreements and make an effort to secure Arab and especially Palestinian interest in the possibilities and options which that agreement opens out towards a future solution, knowing that Israeli opinion is divided down the middle between the idea of a coercive unitary structure and the possibility of a territorial agreement. I make no apology at all for this dissent. I find that our friends in this country are somewhat infuriating. They say to me 2 things. First of all, Israel is a great bastion of democracy. And then they say, how come that you're not all agreed and united on all the issues which are complex and controversial? If we're a democracy, we have no right to be united. Do not ask us for unanimity. I haven't noticed much of it amongst you either. Dissent is the glory of democracy, the burden and the glory. We were asked by the United Nations to establish a Jewish state. You cannot have a Jewish state and also have a unanimous state. Dissent is built into the very physical texture of our nation. We reach agreements not through the blind acceptance of authority, but by the interaction of contradictory and alternative choices. And there is enough range of option, especially amongst the two major parties, to encourage the Arabs and the Palestinians to understand that nothing is excluded except a threat to Israel's security. And the range of options once you enter negotiation is much broader than anything achievable by the present mood of militant radicalism. It is not true that you need confidence for negotiation. Confidence does not create negotiation. Negotiation creates confidence. And it is by entering a negotiating process and posture that the Palestine Arabs, Syria and Jordan could have the same effect in the unfreezing of Israeli vulnerabilities as President Sadat explored and achieved. We make no apology for these vulnerabilities. In Israel, about 10 days ago, a British Foreign Secretary asked me why we have this obsession about our security. Before I had time to answer him, he'd stopped being Foreign Secretary. Well, I said to him, as I say to you, I don't object to the word obsession. Call it an obsession if you will. We are entitled to our sovereign obsessions. The only people in history that mourns the loss of 6 million of its kinsmen, carried off in a tidal wave of violence and hatred. The only people that broods on the tragic mystery of 1 million Jewish children thrown into the furnace. The only state in the international community that hasn't known a single day of peace in all the years of its national existence. How can such a people in such a state not have an abnormally sensitive attitude to problems which affect its security? This vulnerability of Israel should be accepted as the lesson and the history of our experience. Our experience hasn't been normal, and therefore our relation to security cannot ever be normal. It's still the only nation that faces the problem of its security anew with every approaching nightfall and every rising dawn. Israelis, therefore, are much more conscious, by reason of their Jewish identity, much more conscious of dangers than of opportunities. The great philosopher of modern Jerusalem, Martin Buber, once said that anxiety is the essence of the Jewish condition. Well, there is room for that anxiety. Faced by new ideas or proposals, the Israeli reaction is not to ask, what are the opportunities? That is not a Jewish question. What are the dangers? That is a Jewish question. And it is the product of history. Therefore, this complex of vulnerability must be unlocked and cannot be unlocked by unilateral Israeli will. It has to be a convergence of an Israeli search for peace and an Arab unfreezing of past attitudes. And instead of putting this as a theoretical doctrine, I put it on the basis of the empirical experience bequeathed by the originality and audacity of Muhammad Anwar Sadat. Nor do I believe that this bridge can be crossed without external assistance. The American role has been crucial in all the contractual successes of the past 8 years. It has been a period of contractual success. The ceasefire, the disengagement with Egypt, the disengagement with Syria, the Sinai Agreement, Camp David, the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, none of them would have been effective without a resourceful and assertive American mediation. During the era when Henry Kissinger conducted the first stepping stones during the disengagement agreements, and these are set out in the first 1,500 pages of the second volume. As I think those achievements are fully set out, because to believe otherwise would be to assume that he has omitted something for the sake of modesty. In my own review of Volume 1, The White House Years, in the British Monthly Spectator, I wrote, I don't know if Henry Kissinger is a great writer, but if you get through this book, you've got to be a great reader. I'm collecting Harvard impressions because I'm having lunch with him on Saturday. But it is an accurate account which makes the Geneva Conference the starting point of a process, the snowball which became the avalanche and which eventually swept the barriers of hostility away. Now, the United States has a role to play which it is not now playing. And I deplore the lack of activity, of intellectual resourcefulness in the Camp David process during the past 3 or 4 years. There's not been a high-level emissary in those negotiations for some years. The autonomy talks have been plodding along without any visible movement. It was George Bernard Shaw who said that statesmanship sometimes consists of marking time so vigorously as to give the impression of moving forward. And it is this kind of energetic immobility that the autonomy talks have been characterized by. Nothing will move without American assertiveness. In the political context, most of us are supposed to want mediators to be very meek and mild. I'm not sure that that will work. I fully accept the New Testament statement that the meek shall inherit the earth. The question is whether, having inherited it, they will continue to be meek. And this is the lesson of the third world. We need more assertiveness. Wherever mediation has been assertive, sometimes even abrasive, Ralph Bunche for the armistice agreements, Kissinger for the shuttle diplomacy, President Carter in the final stages of the Camp David agreement, we've ended up by signing agreements. Wherever mediation has been weak, as with the Yaring mission, the Rogers-Cisco effort, too easily relinquished in 1973, nothing has ensued. But instead of putting its mind on these matters, we find American diplomacy caught up in the problem of the military balance. Perhaps I ought to be much more grateful to be described as a strategic asset. I must tell you that I led the opposition in the Knesset to the strategic asset agreement. What we want to be is not a strategic asset, but a free and lucid and humane society, sustained by a spiritual legacy and putting its strength into the service of a harmonious regional order. And therefore the idea that you can gain stability by spreading arms around and creating a self-generating arms race, AWACS and F-16 here in Saudi Arabia and Jordan, and then compensating Israel by a further rearmament of Israel, which constitutes a crushing burden on our economy, that is not the correct approach. And briefly, what we ask from America is less arms and more ideas, less strategy and more diplomacy. And that, I think, has been the weakness of the last few years. By this, I don't want to give the impression that America and Israel have always agreed with each other. If America were always to agree with Israel, America would have to be right 100% of the time. And we have never expected or received such total rectitude from anybody. In the second volume of the trilogy that I've quoted, Kissinger quotes my definition of objectivity. He says, Eban's idea of objectivity is the blind acceptance of all Eban's views. Well, I don't believe that anybody else has a different definition of objectivity. He certainly hasn't. But if we exclude the idea of total objectivity, we come back to the idea of a common purpose and a common emphasis. And the American role should be far more diplomatic than strategic. and its import into the Middle East should be much more of solutions, at least for the interim proposal. I don't think you'll get an autonomy agreement on the basis of an Egyptian or an Israeli document. Therefore, there should be American proposals to which each of them could relate, and there are many domestic reasons for which a third-party starting point is more likely to rally the parties to an agreement than to expect one of them to accept the polarized position of the other, when each of them is under domestic inhibition, Israel by its parliament, and Egypt by the aspiration of restoring its position within the Arab world. This then is the picture of ambivalence, a sense of general fulfillment, and behind it a sense of disquiet, lest the immobility that now prevails might put at issue even that which we have achieved. If you ask me what will happen after April the 26th, I'm very reluctant to make a prediction. I decided very early in my political career never to try to be a prophet in Israel. For one thing, there's too much competition. And everybody who's tried his hand at that occupation has deservedly got himself into very deep trouble. The only prediction I make is this, that after April the 26th will come April the 27th. And whether the necessity not to allow immobility to take root, because even what we have achieved stands in need of ratification by further progress. If there is nothing but deadlock on the Palestine issue, if there is nothing but an indefinite horizon of coercive jurisdiction over another people, then not only shall we have betrayed the hope of the future, but even the achievement of the past will be put into hazard. This is therefore, without exaggeration, a very formative hour. And if Israel appeals here to the confidence of its friends, our credentials for that appeal are the achievements that we have together accomplished in these 3 decades. We have not disappointed all the hopes of our friends. We have restored our Jewish pride. We have given our people a sense of its collective creativity. We have given life and beauty to mankind's most neglected but most cherished landscapes. We have made some communication to the rest of the world of intellectual dynamism, social originality, and recuperative power. Above everything else, we have fulfilled our human vocation. We have brought hundreds of thousands of our kinsmen from the valley of the shadow of death into the emergence of a new life and a new hope. This is a great and noble adventure. It merits from us that we shouldn't abandon it in the middle of the way. Stand with us, constant, steadfast, unflinching, until the obstacles are surmounted and the task is done.
It's a great pleasure to hear such eloquence, such vision. The Foreign Minister is consented to answer a few questions for us. If the questions could be put directly and succinctly, and since I promised some of the dinner guests that they might have a chance to put a question first if they had one, if anyone in the front rows has a question, if you'll put it quickly, you can have your say. If you don't, you'll be overcome by people on the first, second, and third tiers. On the other tiers, if you would go to one of the microphones, that would be an advantage. If you can't get to one, you'll have to stand up and speak loudly. Would you like to recognize him? Is there a question in the front row? If not, we go here. Yes.
I'd be happy to answer that question if I could remember how it began. But I think that I'd like to address myself to the question, do I believe that Israel's problem is a lack of acceptance of its legitimacy? My feeling is that, on the whole, we have won the battle for the recognition of an international system of which Israel is an indispensable part. I have the feeling that when we put up our flag in May 1949 in the international community, this marked the acceptance of an international system with Israel. It is true that some of the rejectionist states, and even their rhetoric is changing, still profess to believe that they'll have a map of the world without Israel. I have not found much trace of that anywhere else. And here, even those who are not favorable to our policies are generally respectful of our identity. I would say that even those in the Soviet Union, for example, who oppose our policies, do not threaten or challenge our identity. We had this discussion in my talk with Mr. Gromyko in 1973. It was clear that he had reservations against our policy, and we against his policy, but not against our identity. He even stated that the Soviet Union led the rest of the world in the recognition of Israel, which was true. And he said that he still recognized our right to exist. I reciprocated by recognizing the right to exist. Out of this this courteous exchange revealed that, in fact, there is no serious international element that doubts the fact of Israel's existence. We are not really destructible. I don't want to make gestures about our power, but Israel is certainly the most powerful small state that has ever existed in human history. That is to say, there's never been a community of 3.5 million people which possesses such firepower as does Israel. And therefore I do not accept the vision of Israel as portrayed in one of our cartoonists' works as the small and tiny and aggrieved victim always being trod on, and all this rhetoric about Israel, a small state and a poor state and a new state. Well, first of all, we're not such a young state. We're one of the veterans of the modern international community. Most of the members of the United Nations are younger in their sovereignty than Israel. We were the 59th member of the United Nations, and the number now is 159. At least that was the number when I left New York this morning. So that not only in terms of its nationhood, but of its statehood, Israel is a veteran of the international community. We're not such a poor state. Of the 159, more than 120 have a lesser per capita average income than Israel. We don't have the per capita average income of North America, although my friend, the governor of the Bank of Israel, says that we live as though we do. But it is certainly on a very high level. Where else do you have a country in Asia exporting $6 billion worth of goods and services, $6 billion this year in exports? Probably the highest per capita proportion of exportable energy of any nation on earth. What other country of that size and age sells sophisticated jet aircraft in the West and electronic equipment of the most complex kind? So we're not all that poor, we're not all that young, not all that small. There are some 83 countries which have a smaller population than Israel in the modern world. And therefore I don't think that the idea that our existence is at stake is one that I can adopt, nor for tactical and psychological reasons do I think that we should appear as a country whose existence proportions. We do need world opinion, and we've worked hard for it. You might be surprised, however, to hear me say that a good image cannot be the central objective of a state. And if there's a tension between security and image, then security must prevail. It's some years since the late Hans Morgenthau shocked the international community just after the World War by his statement that there is not one single instance of a modern state which has changed its foreign policy in obedience to extra-national public opinion. But I believe that's exact. National public opinion makes you change your policy. I don't have to tell you that. The United States changed its policy because national public opinion was not against continuing the Vietnam War. You didn't change it because Sweden was against it. or international agencies. So therefore we mustn't make a fetish of it. If I have to choose between being popular and being alive, I choose to be alive. Because if I'm alive, I can work hard to reconstruct our popularity. Whereas if we are dead, we shall be very popular during the funeral oration, but it will be a very temporary and superficial consolation. In the press, there are different views. Some of our problems are objective. First of all, our adversaries are very powerful and very strong and very rich, and their ability to influence the media, to put their case, has been dramatically multiplied over recent years. And there are objective difficulties. I come back to this theme, which is the crucial Israeli predicament. Any country that is ruling a foreign people, even if that is forced upon us, as it is today, cannot expect to have an affirmative image of that spectacle. There's no way out. There is an esprit du siècle, there's a zeitgeist, there is a spirit of the times. This is not an age in which that can be sustained. I don't think we can change that until we have security and a boundary settlement. But to think that you can have that and a favorable press is rather like asking for what our first president Weizmann used to say. He says, you want a warm frost. There isn't such a thing as a warm frost. And some of our difficulties are therefore objective. As regards the past, Der Yassin belongs to the past. Well, I must say that some of our honourable members on the other side believe that we should engage the public attention with the following problem. Who killed Mr. Chaim Arlozorov? And I can't imagine your Congress successfully getting a vote to appoint a commission of inquiry under the Chief Justice to discover what lay behind the murder of Abraham Lincoln and reviving all the acrimonies of that period. I rather resent that anachronism. On the other hand, what happened in Beirut is not the past, because this is part of our predicament now. In other words, do you make an unlimited and unrestrained use of your military power, or do you take such minimal precautions for self-defense as do not involve an escalation of violence? That was the issue in Beirut, and you rightly say that this was not a general consensus. And this it arose in the last few days, when, as you must have read, the support of the opposition was sought for a very large eruption into Lebanon, and we withheld our support, which is probably one reason why it hasn't happened. That's a very great predicament. It has to be weighed in the light of all the options. And I was astonished, if you speak about the press, there was an article in the New York Times criticizing Israel for not invading Lebanon. Mr. William Safire, irresolution. Why doesn't Israel invade Lebanon? Why didn't we knock the Syrian missiles out? Sitting in Washington, it's very easy to write that, but Syria happens to have a treaty of mutual defense with the Soviet Union. So we're criticized sometimes for being far too discreet and sometimes for being too eruptive. Perhaps that means that we might have found a balance.
While I, too, am very, very sympathetic to the claims of the Palestinians, I often come up against what seems to be an insoluble problem with the possibility of a Palestinian state. That is, the Palestinians in the West Bank then aiding their Palestinian brethren in Jordan, who are a majority of the population, to overthrow the Hussein regime and formulate one very large Palestinian entity, which then constitutes a wedge into Israel that it would seem to me is more dangerous than any other Arab wedge that has ever been actually within the heart of Israel. And I wonder if you would comment on that.
In order to establish a Palestine-Jordanian state, which we would only accept if there were a change of Israeli boundaries, different from those of 67, because we can't have security within the boundaries of 67. But if those territorial changes were feasible and agreed, then we would like the population of the West Bank to join with their Palestinian brethren on the other side of the Jordan. It's the same people. In order to achieve that, you don't have to overthrow King Hussein. It's not for me to suggest if he be overthrown or not. Anyway, people have been talking about overthrowing King Hussein ever since 1952. And he came to the throne, and you might forget this, when President Truman was President of the United States and Mr. Churchill was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and Marshal Tito was the doyen of the Balkan countries. And I've heard him say that he's often described as a fragile regime, but he goes to the funerals of all the non-fragile Arab leaders. So I've stopped making this prediction. The fact is that for a period there was a structure of a Jordanian-Palestine state, the creation of what was called a Jordanian-Palestine family, and it's a much more natural condition than a fragmentation of the Palestinians into a Jordan and a Palestine state. Why should there be a fragmentation? The object of which is to exercise pressure through a small irredentist state, exercising hostile pressure on Jordan to the east and on Israel to the west. Why have a fragmentation of the Palestine people with explosive results? Why create another island if you don't have to? The River Jordan is not an international boundary. It does not divide two people of separate language or faith or identities, and therefore I think that is the logical result of a negotiation. I would say that I don't think it has to be a hostile wedge. The West Bank could be demilitarized. That's one reason why in our party we do accept a Jordanian-Palestinian solution and not a separate Palestine solution. Demilitarization of the West Bank is a condition for Israeli withdrawal. I've never heard of a whole country being demilitarized. I have heard of countries, one of whose provinces is demilitarized. In fact, that is true of Egypt. The Sinai is virtually demilitarized. And therefore a Jordanian-Palestine framework makes demilitarization possible and therefore makes an Israeli withdrawal possible to secure boundaries to be determined. And I think we would accept that risk as a lesser one than the explosive risk of having a permanent irredentist hostility within the blood and arteries of your own state. So.
Yes, you spoke of the fact that there are close to half or more than half of Israelis who are interested in a peaceful solution with Palestinians. But I'd like to ask if you can offer some hope of similar wishes on the part of either the PLO or whether there's another constituency within the Palestinians.
No, that's why there is immobility, because the debate in Israel is not paralleled by any similar debate on the other side. Once you have the Palestinians having a debate about Israel, such as that which Israelis have about them, you're halfway towards peace. It is their lack of intellectual innovation and diversity that is much more responsible for the deadlock than any attitudes on the Israeli side, even attitudes that I deplore. It is not true that Israel is the sole source of the deadlock. The major source of the deadlock is the absence of a conceptual change in the Palestinian attitude towards the acceptance of Israel's legitimacy. Well, there isn't any alternative to waiting for them, because we cannot have peace without their consent. You can have war without consent. You can't have peace without consent. War can arise from a unilateral decision. Peace needs a reciprocal decision. Therefore, what I would advocate is to hold the line in the hope that this change will take place. But this leads to another problem, which divides our people. If you want to keep that option open, you refrain from doing things which would close that option in the future. So that if you believe in an eventual territorial agreement, you arrange your settlement policy in such a way as would leave the populated areas in a position where you could detach it. And that's why we have a different settlement policy. We wouldn't put them in the heart of the populated areas, but would hold the West Bank in a temporary atmosphere and in such condition that if circumstances arose, it could be detached into an Arab jurisdiction. So. Well, that is another question under debate in Israel itself. I see that the mayors have been dismissed. My party took the responsibility in 1976 for holding these elections, and we're proud of that decision. It was a calculated risk. But if we endured the mayor of El Bira for 7 years, I would have endured him for another 7 years. He's not a very amiable gentleman. I don't agree with a word of what he said. But if dismissing him is the snowball which sets off this avalanche, I would look back to the days before he was dismissed and prefer that to the present situation. In other words, we would have stood by the results of the 1976 election. We are under criticism by the other party for having had those elections. It's a better situation to have the truth brought to light, instead of which even that limited autonomy on the municipal level has now unfortunately disappeared, and we have Israeli officers as mayors of Nablus and Ramallah. That is the opposite of autonomy. And so I hope that the discussion in Israel will lead to a restitution, some election process which will take the burden and the responsibility at municipal level off the Israeli army and onto the shoulders of elected Arab representatives, if not to those who have been dismissed and to others. But I wouldn't have dismissed the mayors and the whole of the council. If the mayors had offended, I would have been satisfied with their departure, but would have sought some solution within the Arab family in El Bira and in Hebron and in Ramallah and in Nablus. But to go from an elected Arab mayor to an appointed Israeli officer, that is not in conformity with the idea of full autonomy, which the Israeli government wisely signed at Camp David. So at the back. I beg your pardon, I didn't catch that. Yes. Yes, I see that. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm very grateful for the question. I can only invite you to Israel and ask you to ask that question as loudly as possible. There you go. We don't have a personal system. The question that comes before that one is which party will hold the major responsibility. And here, Americans seem unaware of the fact that there are two parties which have an equal mandate. In other words, the Labour Party and the Likud Party each has an equal mandate. And if the Likud Party forms the government, it's not because it has a bigger mandate, it has 48 members. It's because it has a greater facility of cooperation with the religious parties on grounds which have nothing to do with what we've been discussing, which have to do with a completely different complex, including one party which doesn't accept the idea of a unitary structure, so that it's somewhat a chance that their doctrine is now in full authority and ours is not. But you know that the margin is narrow. I was delayed coming here because we had a tie vote on the question of confidence, and a tie vote is a failed vote. The Prime Minister said that despite that technicality, if there was a tie vote, he would go and resign. But he was able to organize people to persuade him not to resign, which is also one of the accepted maneuvers to invite pressure upon oneself and then acceding to it with visible reluctance. But it means things are narrow, and we then had a vote on the national budget, and it was carried by one vote. Failure on the national budget is equivalent to a lack of confidence. There would have to be a resignation if the budget proposal was rejected. In other words, everything is open and life is interesting. I don't know if that's a good thing. I think it was Montesquieu who said, "Happy the nation whose history is uninteresting." Well, we're not likely to have that fate. So. Well, the fact is that the major religious party, the National Religious Party, lived with us within a partition philosophy for 29 years. Firstly, in governments in which there was actually a state of Israel without a West Bank, and they never suggested that we should recapture it, although we had the power. And then from 1967 to 1977, we were in a cabinet with the religious party on the basis of a temporary tenure of the West Bank and Gaza. That was the doctrine of the government until 1977. We held these territories until such time as there was a negotiated settlement. I don't remember the National Religious Party saying that it couldn't live with that. My feeling is that we would have to separate historic and religious sentiment, from modern experience, most Israelis must be able to understand that we cannot allow the past to preempt the future. We should be inspired by the past, but we cannot be the servants of enslaved by it. We have no historic obligation to reconstruct the boundaries of King David and King Solomon. They didn't consult me about their boundaries, and I'm not obliged to consult them about mine. They did the best that they could in the conditions of those times. We must do the best in the conditions of our times. I think that the key is not so much the Israeli people, but if the territorial compromise was made feasible by a Palestinian or an Arab gesture, that would set the debate in motion. But Israelis say, why should we argue amongst ourselves about alternative proposals when they reject everything? When they reject the extreme proposals, they reject the moderate proposals, they reject the compromises. But that creates a kind of artificial immobility. But I still think that if this change did take place in the Palestinian Arab community, Israeli moods and emotions would move with great flexibility. It's a voice from on high. Yes, indeed. Of anybody's recognition of it, our right to exist does not depend on somebody else's right. We are. The fact that he would argue with me doesn't impress me very much at all, I'm afraid. But I think what I mean is that we are part of an international community symbolized by the family of sovereign states, and that what happened in 1949 when we were admitted to the international community is irrevocable, and that is the international system, and you cannot go behind it. You must take the existence of states for granted and not come to a negotiation and say that my existence, my legitimacy is still hanging in a vacuum, awaiting confirmation by the royal house of Saudi Arabia. It doesn't await their confirmation. It exists. We have achieved it, and let's now take that for granted and not negotiate it again. I've never heard of a country renegotiating its own legitimacy once that has been achieved. And therefore, Israelis who go around saying, please recognize my right to exist, that is, in my opinion, neither a logical nor a very useful attitude. Yeah. Well, that is really the question, and the absence of an answer leaves me in the pathos of this suspense. Nobody imagined that Anwar Sadat would take that attitude. After all, 6 months before he came to Jerusalem, he was saying that he will never negotiate with an Israeli until the last inch of Arab land has been evacuated, and that in this generation there will never be peace. And exactly why this spirit fell upon him. It fell upon him because of a very, not only vision, but a clear-sighted view of his own interests. Also because he felt that the military option had been exhausted by the wars of 1948 and 67, and even 73, the October War, which was a successful war from the Egyptian point of view. It was very successful, but it ended up with Israel much closer to Cairo and Damascus than it had ever been before. And if you call that a successful war, what would happen if there were an unsuccessful war? And I remember in my last conversation with him, I said, why do you always call it the October War, the October War? And I venture to say it's probably because you forget what happened in November. Now, in October, the armies moved forward, and Israel was a very great peril, but in November, the line was straightened, and then we arrived in Suez and Ismailia and Port Said and the Golan Heights. In other words, it was useless. The battle flowed to and fro. Military failure didn't solve their problem. Military success didn't solve it. It solved a psychological problem. They were successful enough in 73 to be able to break the taboo about negotiation. And that's why the 73 war did create an atmosphere favorable to negotiation. After that war, there was enough confidence on the Egyptian side and enough humility on the Israeli side to make a negotiating atmosphere feasible. Now, whether somebody will arise in Syria whether King Hussein will not arise, but go back. After all, he was the pioneer of the idea that Israel's legitimacy had to be recognized. The strange thing is that he was ahead of everybody in that, even holding negotiations with great courage and risk. And it's a very strange transformation, just when it would have less courage and less risk, because Sadat has taken the initiative and the risk. It would be less dangerous for him to do it now, and he doesn't do it now. That's one of the great puzzles. But whether he will return to that role, or whether other Arab states, there might even be some change of vision or view in the Gulf states, in Saudi Arabia, some kind of message from others. I don't know. All I feel is that we have to keep the situation sufficiently tranquil and sufficiently open, with a pluralism of options, so as not to close the door. The tragedy would be that if in a few years there were to arise an Arab leader willing to negotiate a Palestine settlement, and that prospect were to have been foreclosed because we had despaired of it and filled in all the gaps within the territory itself. Thank you very much.
For giving us so much of his time and his views and his vision tonight. We are especially grateful to Foreign Minister Eban. You can see him on the 10 o'clock Channel 2 News if we get him over there in time. So thank you very much.